Chen from Luohan Academy. So from our daily experience, it seems there's very little doubt that digital technology has quickly and yet deeply transforming our economy and the way people live. It has brought both excitement and anxiety to all walks of our life. And in the 50th anniversary of the internet, and at a time when we globally were still spending a lot of time talking about the slowing GDP growth, it seems very pertinent to talk about how to evaluate values beyond GDP. How should we evaluate progress and business values in this age? So it is my great honor to be the host for this session, and we have a very distinguished panel that includes Professor Michael Spence from New York University, Professor Soumitra Dutta from Cornell University, and Professor Reynolds from MIT. So they have all done great work in tracking and understanding how technology has transformed our society. So please come up. Okay, so let's start. And we know that China has turned itself into a mobile-based country. Everything seems available only with a few swipes away from smartphones. But let me start by telling you several of the phenomena Luohan Academy recently has identified, which might be interesting, but none of them are properly reflected in GDP. For example, time benefits. In 2019, the number of ATMs in China fell in the first time in 10 years, as more and more people use mobile payments to save time. Equality. With the help of big data, millions of street vendors are now able to have loans, with the smallest loan being several yuan. And we have also learned that from among the rural entrepreneurs, those who have middle school degree but who are involved into the e-commerce can earn as much as the similar entrepreneurs who have actually college degree but who are not involved into the e-commerce. And digital welfare. More and more people are actually more likely to live not only in big cities but also in small cities. Connectivity. People have become more connected and more virtual. 90% of China's young people they have multiple identities, professions, online and offline. So they talk to each other, connect to each other much more. But this does not mean they disappear from real life. So actually in the past 5 years, the number of people who participate, who go to the public libraries has increased by 11% each year, which doubles the number in the previous decade. And finally, trust. More and more people actually now hail taxis through the apps. And yet, the taxi safety shields between the taxi driver and the customers have disappeared in most of the new taxis. So all those dimensions, connectivity, opportunity, trust, leisure time, seems to be quite relevant to everybody's life. And yet none of them is properly reflected in GDP. So I'm going to ask my first question. So how do you think about those trends? What do you think about other very important metrics that are missing in the current GDP? And why, especially in this age, missing those metrics are important? It's hard, we shouldn't miss them. So we're going to start with Michael.
Well, this is I think a very important question. So all of us are striving for a balanced view of the impact of technology on our economies and societies. And we've heard now in 2 panels, and we'll hear again, that there are enormous positives and tremendous potential on the one side, and significant vulnerabilities and risks on the other. The way I think about it, Shenlong, is as follows. I think we have kind of passed the point of thinking that GDP and material well-being is a good summary of economic and social progress. It's reflected in the SDGs. People simply don't just care about more than that. They care about, as you said, connectivity. One thing that's frequently ignored is they care about security. I mean, living with extreme insecurity is a huge negative in people's lives. They care about health. They care about opportunity. They care about education for themselves and their children, all of the things you've heard. I have 2 things to say about this. One, even a passing knowledge of digital technology tells you that it's going to impact every single dimension, reasonable dimension of well-being, if I can put it that way. And I don't mean material well-being. For example, I mean, and this is just a personal guess, I think the impact of digital technology on healthcare is simply going to be enormous. I wouldn't be surprised if economic historians in the future look back and say it was bigger in some sense than the impact on productivity and traditional measures of economic performance. And finally, people care about social things. So there's a tremendous concern about inequality of outcomes and inequality of opportunity. So the second thing I think that I need to say is that GDP measures none of those things. In fact, GDP is a flow measure. For those of you who aren't economists, it's a flow measure. It's based on market transactions, essentially. So anything that sort of gets left out of that is simply missed. So for example, sustainability. Sustainability is not about what happened this year or last year. It's about whether we can keep doing it for 20 years, not captured. You need balance sheet type items in order to get at that. Inequality, not measured in that, so we now have a growing body of evidence and a huge amount of useful research on that dimension, etc. So, I mean, I don't want to catalog it all, but the bottom line is we are moving to a multidimensional system. And if we sit on that platform and study digital technology, we're much more likely to get a balanced view.
Thank you. Soumitra.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I just wanted to add to what Mike already mentioned. I think, in our discussions, we have focused too much on GDP. And sometimes I'm reminded of the story of the drunk person looking for his keys below a lamp. And you ask the person, did you lose your keys out there? No, but actually, why are you looking out there? Because that's where the light is. So I think we tend to get too obsessed by GDP, even though we know very well that is incomplete on many different measures. Focusing more on technology, because we are at a conference out here. Let me give you a small anecdote. So I was in Cairo some years ago. I took a cab, like many tourists do, and the cab driver was a young Palestinian driver. So he started asking many questions about where I was from, where I was living, and so on and so forth. He seemed to know a lot. So I was very curious about how he knew so much about the parts of the world where I was living in. And he said, I have so many friends, and these friends were on social media, and so on and so forth. So he actually got to know the world through social media technology. And then what was surprising, actually, was that he, like a Palestinian in Cairo, does not have a passport. He's basically a stateless person living in Egypt. He can never travel outside Egypt. Never. Because he doesn't have a passport. He'll never get one. So if you think about it, for this person, the technology is the window to the world. And I think that's where technology really has the highest impact. It is building and encouraging more humanity around us. So I think if you look at, for example, what I think is really required for us is to really think deeply about what is the overall purpose of using technology. Historically, for a long time, we always thought it was for increasing economic activity, productivity, economic activity has been the prime driver, automation, and so on and so forth. But today we know that progress is much more than just productivity growth. Progress is a whole bunch of different things: social progress, sustainability, and overall other kinds of elements of progress. And then if you move up beyond that, there's elements of well-being, happiness, and you move up one level even above that is the whole notion of self-actualization of human beings. What do humans actually aspire to be and what the best that they can be. So I think we have to think a little bit about what is the purpose of using technology in society and companies, and we have to form our strategies according to that, because that's really rethinking of the entire context of technology.
Yeah, thank you very much for the opportunity to be here. We've spent a lot of time looking at the impacts of digital technologies in the world, and we came up with a way that makes sense for us to look at them. I think we put them into a subset of, in some ways, these technologies are a component of GDP. So the networks, the 5G networks that we're talking about, are a component of GDP. There are certain services that are provided that are fully delivered on the internet, and those would be counted in GDP. So that's kind of the first category. We also think about the impact of digital technologies in the way that it can expand the economy as a whole. So think of this as more of a dynamic impact, that by investing in these technologies, we can grow the pie, grow the size of the economy through infrastructure, through the development of platforms like Alipay that you've seen here, the development of these platforms. And then the third one is there are digital impacts, as we've heard, that are outside of GDP. So some of these are consumer surplus, and that's essentially saying I would have paid 100 yuan for this, but I only had to pay 50. So that additional 50 benefit that I got is not counted in GDP. The other thing is, as we've heard about some of these that have been talked about, government transparency. The increase in government transparency that you can get, not captured in GDP. Things like improved health, improved education are not captured in GDP. The problem that I've seen, though, is that the traditional measures that we use pretty much focus exclusively on that first category. It's about what can be counted in GDP, and by doing that, we're essentially underestimating the impact of these technologies.
Let me add a little bit. So, apologize. I should introduce a little bit more. So, Professor Dutta has developed one of the top two most influential technology tracking index, the progress, tracking hundreds of countries, and has been one of the most really influential in the world. And Professor Reynolds has been doing a lot of work in the OECD. So they've been really on the ground tracking the progress and its impact, thinking this for a long time. Now, so as you all have said, there's many important dimensions that are relevant to the society and to individuals, but that are not in the GDP. Now, but given the situation, what do you think? What can we do? How should we move ahead? So, Michael.
Well, I mean, so it's a two-part problem as I see it. Maybe I defer to the experts who've been spending most of their time working on that. So let me be brief. First of all, you have to pay attention to the dimensions. So the academy that Chen Long heads has done a study. The output of that study, which he described briefly, essentially documents inclusive growth patterns. Not GDP growth, although there's probably an element of that, but the inclusiveness of the growth patterns associated with e-commerce and mobile payments and related fintech platforms. So that's an example of doing that. I think that then you have to ask, can we link outcomes in these various dimensions of I'll call it well-being, right? Things that matter to people, to the digital technologies, and that requires considerable expertise and innovativeness. But let me turn it over to Soumitra and Taylor.
So let me give you some experience in terms of having done the technology index for now almost 20 years. We first started the index called the Network Readiness Index of the World Economic Forum in 1999-2000. And back then, the idea very much was to get a group of thinkers together and think of the future. How will technology be used in the future? And we really thought technology as having a very strong interrelationship with society, with the government, with the institutions, and the quality of the overall environment of business and so on. And keep in mind, in 2000, a lot of the focus was on bits and bytes, about what's the bandwidth and what's the number of PCs. It was very technical focus, but we actually thought ahead. And essentially, we built a model that included those elements, societal, regulatory, institutional elements. Today, it seems obvious because we know the impact of social media and how it's actually evolved. But talking about measurement, it comes back to the point I made earlier. Now is a time when we have to rethink the purpose of technology, both at a micro level, at an individual, corporate level, and also the macro level, institutional and a national level. And now we are in fact thinking about how do you start measuring a world in which people and technology have to coexist. And in fact, technology is not just dumb technology, but it's intelligent technology. And how do you put the governance mechanism on this coexistence such that you get the right kind of impact? Sustainable development goals, other elements in terms of prosperity, progress, whatever you want to put out there. But the rethinking and the reconceptualization that technology and people come together as equals, I think is very important in terms of how we think about measurements.
You want to say something?
I think one of the big things we need to focus on is what do we really care about? I really like proverbs, and so being in China, it's fantastic to be here because you have so many great proverbs. I'm going to try and say this proverb in Chinese. It's quite a famous one. It's 水滴洗穿, which water drip, is that correct? Water drip, stone penetrate. And the idea there is that you can have a stone and a drip of water drip, drip, drip over a long period of time, and you can actually destroy the stone with the little drips of the water. To me, what that says is that China and other countries can do really powerful things, do amazing things when they persevere. The problem, the way I want to tie this in though, is we have to make sure that we're putting that drip over the right stone. Because it's going to take a lot of time, we're going to put a lot of effort into it, and we can do amazing things, but what if we're putting it over the wrong thing? So I think in society today, I've noticed in some of the countries that I visit that the younger generation has a different view on what they care about. It's less about money, they care more about free time, about spending quality time. They care more about the environment. They care about things that my generation cared probably less about. And I think we need to kind of align that to make sure that the policies and the networks and the technologies we're building are actually aligning with those desires.
So to summarize, we really have to carefully define the right goals. And because that's where we're going to spend efforts, and also we need to understand the relationship between technology and people and have the right mechanism to make it happen. Now,
could I have one small thing? It's quite common in conversations about this to slip back and forth between what economists call the normative and the descriptive. And I think it's crucial to keep them separate. The measurement challenge is descriptive. We need an objective assessment of things that really matter to people that is accessible to people who may disagree on things that relate to normative discussions like values. So I think while we all want to kind of get along with the solutions, the challenge is let's also try to produce objective, useful measures.
And can I just add maybe one comment? When I work with organizations now and assist them in thinking about technology, I always tell them that you have to have a people-first approach to technology. So when you implement technology, it's not just about what you automate and what you save in terms of cost, quality, time, but what is the impact it's having on people. And if you don't actually understand the impact on people, not in terms of adoption of technology, but impact on the overall quality and well-being and everything else, especially the monitoring capability right now of quantum technology, you'll never be able to get the balance right inside the organization.
Okay, so we now take this technology for granted in many developed worlds. So it's very hard for us to imagine that if one day we do not have internet, what would happen? So Tyler, I know you have done some interesting research in the fallout in the economy if telecommunication network went down. So we really have an audience of Chinese, a lot of the people here that are so used to internet. So from your study, can you share with us a little bit, you think if one day suddenly we do not have internet, what would happen to us?
Yeah.
How big is the loss? Tell us.
Yeah, it's a good question. So it's hard for us to think of life without the internet. But back about 7-8 years ago, there were some big protests that happened in Egypt. And the Egyptian government was fearful that people were talking over the internet to get together and protest. So essentially what they did is they turned off the internet connection for all of Egypt for 5 days. And it turned out that luckily, we were in the process of doing a case study on the Egyptian telecommunications market that was actually done in conjunction with the Egyptian government. So we had all this access to data, and what we did is we looked at what were just the revenue losses for shutting down the internet for 5 days. And it turned out the losses were about $18 million a day in lost revenues for the telecommunication firms. That's relatively small. It's big for Egypt, but relatively small on the grand scale for every single day that the internet was cut off. But there was something interesting that happened. They cut off the internet, and all of a sudden, problems started showing up in New Zealand. So far away in New Zealand. It turns out that New Zealand, Vodafone, which is one of their mobile operators in New Zealand, used call centers in Egypt for their customer service. So by turning off the internet to the country, they actually turned off the internet for the call service, for customer service, for people using their mobile phones in New Zealand. And so Vodafone scrambled to try and hire new people to answer phones because they couldn't reach the people in Egypt anymore. So the government's decision to turn it off for 5 days had a small impact in terms of revenues for the firms, but it had a much larger impact because you can imagine that New Zealand is probably going to rethink that contract in the future with Egypt and say it's too big of a risk. And that's $1 billion industry for Egypt that they need. So it's just thinking about, we rely on these technologies very much for the internet, and turning them off has a massive impact. I do want to point out one more thing though. It's not a permanent impact. So you can imagine if a country were to turn off the internet from one day to the next, you'd have massive disruptions for a certain period of time, but people adapt very well. And what would happen is they would revert back to, they wouldn't buy their shoes online anymore. They'd actually walk down to a store and buy shoes. So you would adapt over time and you'd see the effect of that diminishing, but they would be out of competition with the rest of the world.
So it's just for 1 day of cutting off internet could cause like percentage of the GDP loss or traditional loss of
Right.
economy.
But so the thing is, I wouldn't think of it in terms of GDP loss, because I think that's your exact point, is that it's not the revenues that are lost, it's really about what's the impact overall in the growth of the country.
Okay. So let's change the angle a little bit. I've been to many conferences, to many countries. People ask about China, but a lot of time people actually globally, from my understanding, they don't really understand China very well, because China is very complicated, it's a big country. Sometimes they say this is China. So, and we really want for all countries, to embrace technology in the proper way. And I think China is somehow fortunate, to make some better progress. So compared to some other countries. So in your view, what has made the difference? And is that experience or lessons relevant to the rest of the world, or especially for the emerging markets? What makes the difference? Michael?
Maybe I should take a shot at this. I teach a course on developed emerging economy growth. So let me tell you the conclusion. I mean, first of all, digital technology is a double-edged sword. So let me explain that in two parts. One is there's enormous advances in automation. Think of it as robotics. And that's a combination of fine motor coordination and frankly, the biggest, most important general purpose technology. When we use the word general purpose technology, we mean one that has applications all over the place, right? Across the economy, is image recognition, the ability to see. That's an application of the modern version of artificial intelligence. So So the combination of those things means that robots can do things that they couldn't do even 5 years ago, like electronics assembly, etc. And when you study growth patterns in developing countries, especially in the early stages, the way they connect to the global economy is through labor-intensive, process-oriented manufacturing assembly. This was true in a number of Asian countries. It was true in China until its incomes went up, and it's now in a different set of growth patterns. So that's a real threat. I mean, and the question is, you know, what's the engine that's going to drive the growth for the developing countries? On the other hand, the capacity, if they can find a way to go down the route that China has taken on the e-commerce side, which is, I think, the right way to think of what the platforms have done here is not just to create a platform for commerce, but to create a whole ecosystem that's highly open, that has complementary resources, that has very low entry barriers, and spawns entrepreneurship. And I should say, by the way, that it is, I think, easy to document now that there is an explosion of entrepreneurship globally, virtually everywhere, and it's almost surely very largely explainable by this kind of digital platform. So that's good. I mean, because then you get businesses and you get employment and so on. And if those structures can be expanded so they go beyond borders, then it could be actually a quote new growth model. Now a word about China. Digital technologies have a sort of very distinctive and sort of scary characteristic, and it's easiest to describe in terms of cost structures. Digital technologies have high fixed costs and extremely low variable costs. That's why when Taylor said the consumer surplus doesn't show up, it's because a lot of these goods are free. When you know, every one of you has a 1980s supercomputer in your pocket. There's a huge increase in quality and range of services, and nobody paid for it. Doesn't show up in GDP. So China is a great big homogeneous market, like the United States, perhaps like some others. And so it can invest, both on the public and private sector side, very large amounts, get to the technology frontier, and then deliver it to a set of customers and users that's so large that the average costs go way, way down. A small country can't do that, right? So the economics tell you that the advantage goes to the big homogeneous markets. And the answer to that, I believe, what they're searching for in the previous panel and other things, is ways of transferring that technology, all that know-how, all that AI, etc. How to build an open e-commerce and mobile payments platform to a wide range of countries. And I think if that gets done, you'll see an enormously positive influence on the, I believe that is an external objective of the Chinese people and government, so I'm not pessimistic about that at all.
So you're saying that China has done a successful job in building the infrastructure, the fixed cost part, then that spurred a lot of innovations, the additional stuff, and that seems to be, can be even relevant to other emerging markets, especially for small emerging markets. You can help them to build that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if the people in the room know this, but if you study the growth dynamics of countries, China is absolutely at the upper end in terms of the capacity to invest. China has run at an investment rate, that is gross investment to GDP, in excess of 40% for 40 years. That nobody else can do that.
Okay.
So I completely agree with whatever Mike has said, but let me just add a slightly complementary perspective comparing India and China, because digital technologies, India also has been a strong play out there. I think the growth in China has been phenomenal. A lot of people don't fully realize that between 2004 and 2018, just in 14 years, the economy of China grew by a factor of 6. I mean, 6 times growth in the economy in 14 years. I mean, very few countries can ever hope to achieve something like that. So the growth in China's economy certainly has helped the growth of Chinese digital sector. But I think there's a notion of looking at how did the Indian IT sector develop. It was in the Y2K disruption. So what happened in the Y2K disruption was that the Indian IT companies adopted the software quality processes that were being popularized or created in the US. And they were the early adopters of that and essentially built their businesses on that. India missed the internet, and that's why there's a big race between the US and China about who actually is going to dominate that space. So I think what you see in the space of technologies is that there is a disruption every 10 years or so. And the question is, for China to keep staying ahead, you have to keep moving ahead. Now, clearly the advantage is in the favor of China right now because you have a strong position, you have a large homogeneous market, you have a lot of data capabilities, but that doesn't necessarily guarantee success in every other disruption that comes ahead. And as with the exponential rate of progress in technology, the disruptions will keep emerging. It's not done. The technology revolution is not done as yet. So there'll be more and more things happening in the future.
So Tyler, so you have done a lot of work actually in OECD countries. And you are really trying to promote the growth and adopting digital technology in Europe. But as you can compare your US, China, or Asia, and there's different speeds. From your experience, so what have you learned from this?
Well, one of the interesting things is China is seen as the world leader in mobile payments, but China was not the first to do this very well. I mean, the first countries to do mobile payments extremely well were Japan and Korea. 10, 12 plus years ago, you would pay to get on the bus with your cell phone, and that was like unheard of in any other country that we had. What's interesting to me is that, fast forward 12 more years, China has just shot out in the lead, and part of that is because of scale, and I think that plays a big role. There's a large market here, but I also think there's something special in China about innovation. You've been innovating for thousands and thousands of years. I mean, many of the products, paper, fireworks, that all came from China. So I think it's built into the DNA. There's entrepreneurship here. I think China also plays a big role in standards organizations. So they build technologies and they try and push them out to the world in ways that other countries don't. So I think it makes sense that China's at the front. One word of caution I would say for being at the front of the pack is that sometimes it's possible to push a little too far, too fast. And I would say that privacy is an issue that's going to come up. It's hit us in the United States with some of our social networks where we've allowed access to data, we've come up with really new, interesting, nice services, and then all of a sudden we have a big problem with privacy, that there's too much data out there. I think that's something that China will have to watch out for, just making sure the data is protected.
So it's interesting you actually brought up the four big inventions in ancient China. This kind of contribute to the world, paper, other stuff. But it's interesting. Last time I was in London, I was talking to one famous economist, and he told me that in ancient China we invented four big inventions, but actually China didn't benefit that much from it. It's the Western world, Europe, actually benefit more. But this time seems digital technology was not invented in China, but somehow China was able to really take a lot of these benefits because we have the proper arrangement of the combinations. That seems to be happening. Now,
Paul, can I ask?
Yes, please.
Can I ask a Taylor question, because you know this world well? Could you say a few words about where Europe is? We've kind of covered the rest
on
of
the privacy side.
No, but on digital technology. I mean,
so interestingly, Europe, we say in English, Europe gets a bad rap. And what that means is that sometimes Europe is seen as not quite as innovative. But actually, some of the most interesting technologies are actually born in Europe and grow in Europe. But the challenge for European policymakers right now is that if you have a startup in Paris that's really innovative and does something interesting, you raise some money, you grow, and at one point, you pick up and you leave and you go to Silicon Valley in the United States. And so part of that is access to large amounts of venture capital, which they don't have compared to like China and the United States. And that's a big policy problem, that you're not able to grow these companies. The other issue I would say is access to data. we talk about data as, we've heard it several times today, that data is this new important thing for the economy. In Europe, you have many more restrictions on what you can do with data. In the United States, we're somewhat less restrictions. There's some use, but some restrictions. And in China, the way we perceive it sometimes is that you have fewer restrictions on how you use the data, which gives you more opportunities to innovate.
So can I add something on the European dimension, because I spent many years also in Europe. I completely agree with Taylor in terms of saying that the market fragmentation actually creates a lot of problems for growth for startups in Europe, and that's the reason why they migrate to the US typically, or sometimes in markets. But Europe also has an interesting leadership position in thinking about human rights and values and data biases and data usage in a more ethical, more holistic, humane manner. So I think this focus on environment, progress, human values, human rights, ethical use, I think Europe is probably at the leading edge, and many countries are looking at Europe more as an inspiration for some of their own policies in this area, as opposed to looking at some other markets. Yeah.
I agree, totally agree. Yeah. Me too.
So, so many countries, so there's a logic traditionally of why we care about GDP, because if your income level, economic level is too low, then there's nothing much going on. So GDP seems to be very important. Now, so in the developed countries, then economic growth, of course, has become very slow. So they really should get that much more. But even beyond GDP, but even for the emerging markets, let's just think about the China. China's economy is still growing fast, but slowing down. It's around 6% now, and sometimes we debate about what's going to happen is it's below like 6.5%. What's going to happen 4%? Maybe someday it will come. So my question here is that for the emerging markets now, so they are still going through the traditional route of the industrial growth. The kind of care about GDP. But in the meantime, we care about beyond stuff. And because the digital technology brings a lot of inclusion issues. So this both are happening at the same time. So my question here is that for a country like China, it's kind of both waves, technological waves, hitting us at the same time. Do you think the issue of the beyond GDP, track this value, is more important or less important?
I think you said it right. So it depends on where you are, right? So I chaired a commission on growth and development 10 years ago that was meant to kind of update our knowledge based on experience of how do you grow, how do you sustain growth rates of the type that China has experienced and some others. And people would ask, why do you focus on growth with respect to the countries that still have relatively low per capita incomes? And the answer wasn't because they care about only growth. They're no different as human beings than anybody else. It's that almost none of these other objectives, or a very large number of them, cannot be achieved at very low levels of income. If the per capita income is $700, arithmetically, you can't reduce absolute poverty, right? And so on. You can't afford an elaborate healthcare system or even a growth in it without a whole lot of external aid focusing in, and that's not the way countries want to grow. So the short version of that is the reason for focus on growth in that class of countries, and there's still a bunch of countries in this category, is because it's a means to an end, not the end in itself. Once you get richer, then you have the resources to invest in a wide range of things, and the multidimensional framework becomes important. And finally, in China, I think, until you achieve the goal, the clearly stated goal of being somewhere in the high income category, growth will continue to be an important objective, but it won't be first place with second place, almost off the page anymore. And that transition's already occurred in China. And I think, I mean, people ask this question all the time. At what stage in growth should you pay attention to the environment? And the answer is sooner than you think. Why? Because, you know, if you pay attention to it too late, then you've built a whole lot of structures that are energy inefficient. You know, you probably, based on experience, have, you know, subsidies for fossil fuels. Imagine a world that's trying to wean itself from fossil fuels. You've probably got a whole bunch of industries that are energy intensive because they, you know, you had subsidies, so all the stuff came in instead of going out, etc. I mean, I don't, you know, we could spend hours on this, but the bottom line is probably earlier rather than later in that sense. So that, maybe that'll get us started anyway.
Yeah, just to add one small element from the digital perspective to the growth discussion, I think the digital economy and the notion that digital is exponential and you have exponential growth of, you know, whatever variable you're looking at, has somehow fueled this storyline that you can keep on having growth forever. And growth forever is A, not possible, and B, not required and not the desirable outcome. If you take, for example, a simple thing like Uber, you know, Uber can keep on growing, but guess what? The number of cars in Manhattan, for example, has increased by a factor of 5 taxis. You know, you have 40, 50,000 taxis more than what there were before in Manhattan. And it's causing a lot of damage now to the environment, and now Manhattan has put a certain toll on the cars, the taxis. I'm sure something similar is happening in Beijing, probably, in the cities in China. So I think we have to be able to balance out or moderate this capacity of digital technologies to create exponential trends with the kind of impact that society might actually need to balance out the different elements.
Okay, we still have a couple of important questions to move on a little faster. So not only should we care about different measures beyond GDP in relation to the macroeconomy, but probably actually companies are also rethinking about their values too in this age. Back in 2014, when Alibaba went public, it actually invited 8 customers to New York because they think they are the most representative of the company. And recently we've noticed that some CEOs from some of the biggest companies from the United States, they claim that a company's value is not just about shareholders. So Alibaba's one of the core values is that customer first, employee second, and shareholder third. So recently from the United States, a lot of CEOs also claimed that it's also, they are really serving all the participants, including the customers, employees, suppliers, community, and finally the shareholders. So it seems that, do you think this is like a common trend in this age? If that's the case, why? Who's going to take this?
Well, I could begin. I think, clearly it's not just only customers first. What societal business leaders are saying are society and the environment and all the broader context first. Because we cannot actually exist to keep on making profits if the environment is going to the dogs, or if, for example, society is dysfunctional, as inequality is high. So I think the issue is becoming broader than customers. It's really becoming a society, inequality, divisions, fractured society as a whole. And people are realizing this because of increased inequality. The gap between the CEOs and the average income in companies has just kept on increasing. The concerns around inequality in the West, OECD countries, are extremely high right now. So I think people are basically reacting to societal events and societal pressures. Also the employees, younger generation employees, are much more concerned about these kinds of issues. They want to see a response in the companies. So I think there's a number of trends that are coming together, and I would say that it is late, but never too late, to have this kind of response from the business leaders. I think it's very important for them to act on this.
Yeah, I completely agree.
I mean,
what?
Okay, pretty fast.
No, really fast. I mean, I think that the shareholder value maximization model was a phase that was dominated in the United States and to some extent in the Anglo-Saxon world, and was never really fully accepted. So in China, I believe that a corporation that is believed to be badly aligned with, important economic and social objectives, that's not acceptable. So I think we're all converging toward a multi-stakeholder model, and the reason you heard in the last panel, which is, it's almost impossible to imagine dealing with our major challenges that Soumitra just enunciated if the corporate sector is disengaged.
Can I just add one quick thing there, super quick? But you have a role as consumers to help guide this, because if you are consumers who are buying just on price, then we feed into that, it's all about revenues. But if you make your choices not so much based on price, but also about other characteristics, the environment, those things, you can make a difference.
Just to summarize of what we have talked about today, it seems that if we think about the value system beyond the GDP, we should at least have three principles. The first, it should be well-being based. We should think about beyond, rather than transaction per se. We have to ask whether the technology can enable a pursuit for a better life. So well-being is important. The second is overall social benefits. So the benefits we'll talk about not only individuals' well-being, but also the sustainability, inclusion, equality, opportunities, those issues. The third dimension also important, measurability. Because traditionally we use GDP, as you mentioned, because we can only measure that. And nowadays there's a lot of things, well-beings, are measurable. So we should have the smart ways to do it. So well-being based, social benefits, and the measurability seems to be the principle. And I just noticed that recently there's no new Nobel Prize. It seems to fit this category. For example, we think about the winners. They were rewarded. It seems to they care about the poverty, the well-being issues. They care about the social impacts, and they come up with seems to be interesting ways, smart ways to measure how we deal with the poverty. So, Michael, you are the Nobel Prize winner. Do you think seems to be right? And what do you think about this?
Yeah, it's absolutely right. It's a really wonderful award just on the merits, Chen Long, but it's also a wonderful signal. Because when you stand back and think about it, these are people who worried about one really important dimension of the distributional aspects of growth patterns, namely the bottom end of the distribution, and not about growth itself. And the second thing they did, I think, which is also important, it's really why they got the award, is a lot of us talk about poor people, but seen from a very long distance away. Esther Duflo, who's one of the recipients of the Nobel Prize, says it's like a cartoon. We don't actually know what's going on there. And what these people have done is to go, in multiple places around the world and ask the question, what is it exactly that is constraining the opportunities for poor people? Is it because they're poor and can't invest? Is it the lack of, financing? Is it that they don't have a digital or some other kind of identity and so on? And then they have asked the follow-on question, which is, are there effective policy interventions that are specific to their circumstances, and can we provide evidence, that these kinds of things work and these kinds of things don't? So it is really path-breaking, but breaking work. But what I really like about it, other than they're just wonderful, innovative contributors to economics, is that it sends the signal that there's more to growth than GDP.
So that fits the beyond GDP. Right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the kind of work which you also leading in the Luohan Institute in Alibaba, I think you have access to so much data, and big data can provide the kind of basis for this kind of experimentation, evidence-based decision making. So I think that's a tremendous asset that you have. And certainly China can be a very important playground, a sandbox for actually making this kind of experiments happen in the future.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, nothing to add.
Okay, so it's a great discussion, but unfortunately time is up. So if I give you a last chance, if we think about to summarize beyond GDP to measure the progress, a couple of sentences, what would you say?
Taylor.
I would just start by saying, keep up the good work, but pay attention to security and privacy issues as you go.
I would say think very carefully about the purpose of using technology, and most likely the purpose has to be people-driven and people-centered.
Yeah, and I would say the same thing as Soumitra, but I'd say remember one thing that we tend to forget, which is we sometimes think technology walks along and then we have to adapt human beings to it. But actually, you can adapt technology to the capabilities that we as human beings are. Alibaba has done that. There are numerous examples, but it's a way of implementing what Soumitra just said.
Okay, thank you.